Good evening, Professor. Thank you for your time and accepting this interview. We really feel it's a great honor to have a talk with you.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
I want to start today's interview with your great theory, Thucydides trap. You talk about ruling power and then the rising power conflict, which is exactly U.S. and China today. But I want to focus in particular on Taiwan. Taiwan. How should Taiwan do? One of the themes of our conference is when elephants clash, will Taiwan survive? So I want to start by asking you, Thucydides, U.S., China, we heard a lot. But what should Taiwan do? I think Taiwan seems to be caught in the middle, and we feel, a lot of pressure.
Well, you already said correctly, there's a geopolitical principle that says when the elephants make war, the grass gets trampled. So that's a good reason why Taiwan has a very clear interest in the elephants not making war. So you rightly say that to try to understand what's happening in relations between the U.S. and China, the best place to start is with Thucydides. And Thucydides, the founder and father of history, wrote famously 2,500 years ago that when a rapidly rising power, like Athens, seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power, most frequently the outcome is war. Often a tragic war, frequently a war neither of the parties actually wanted. So how can this happen? I try to explain that in my book, Destined for War. And in that book that was published just as Trump became president, it's now almost 7 years ago, it predicts about the future, says, expect things to get worse before they get worse. So if Thucydides were asked today, now 7 years on, how is this relationship developing? He would say, I believe, it's right on track. Each of the parties, the rising and the ruling, almost as if they were competing to see which can better exemplify the classic role of the rising power and the ruling power, and that they're accelerating on the current path towards what he expects will be the grandest collision of all times. So, unfortunately, I would expect things to get worse before they get worse.
Right. And in your book, I think there's a mention about I don't know the history, but there's a small island, Milo or something. They are,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, that they are caught in the between. And that reminded me of Taiwan today. And Milo, I guess, didn't want to surrender to, and then I don't know whether it's Athens or Spartan. They didn't want to surrender. But in the end, they were all slaughtered in the end. So what can we learn from that lesson?
Well, I think we can learn from that lesson that when two great states are in a Thucydidean rivalry, as Athens and Sparta were, and as the U.S. and China are today, it's extremely dangerous. And even in the book, I describe the dynamics of a Thucydidean rivalry. So it's as if we talk about the balance of power in international politics. Better metaphor is the seesaw of power, like a seesaw on a kid's playground. And one's on one end and one on the other. And when the seesaw is shifting rapidly, what happens? The angle of vision changes. So I used to be looking down on you. Now I'm looking up. Okay? The psychology changes. I used to be in charge because I had my feet on the ground. Now I can feel my feet lifting up. What the hell is going on here? Who do you think you are? Why do you imagine you've been successful growing up? And so each ruling power always imagines the rising power should be grateful. And each rising power imagines that the ruling power is trying to hold it down. And then in the politics, the domestic politics, in each of the parties, nobody wants an opponent on their right on an issue of national security. So each tries to show, I'm tougher than he is. And you can see this in the hopscotch going on in the U.S. politics, where everybody's to show, I can bash China better than you can. So in that situation, misunderstandings are magnified. Miscalculations are multiplied. External actions that wouldn't otherwise have any impact. For example, the debate that occurred over Coursera, that's really the current island of Corfu, which really neither the Spartans nor the Athenians cared much about, but it triggered a vicious spiral that drug them into a war that neither of them intended or wanted. So I would say that's the reason for paying careful attention to the ways in which this dangerous dynamic can go awry. Now, fortunately, 4 of the 16 cases in the last 500 years where we had a Thucydidean rivalry ended in no war. So war not inevitable. It's only if we leave things to business as usual, we should expect history as usual. But that's a challenge to do better, yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to the position for small country. Should small country, caught in between the rival, should they be neutral, like Singapore? Say Singapore is always neutral. They don't want to choose side. But right now, it seems to be that's not good enough because the big part say, hey, you are on my camp. And China say, hey, Taiwan, we should unify one day. And the U.S. is say, no. So we don't know. Each party is forcing us to choose side. So what should we do?
I say, again, remember what the elephants in the grass. There's no good options. What you can do is be careful to be sure you're not the source of the problem, that you're not the provocation. So when I make my list of the ways in which the current rivalry could end in war, one of them has aggressive action by China. That's obviously a danger. But another one has a provocation by Taiwan. For example, if your new president, once he's elected, actually says, okay, it's time for me to say what I really believe, we should be a separate and independent country. I think if he does that, I believe that provocation will lead China to go to war. And I think that any Chinese government that didn't respond in that way would soon find itself no longer the government. Okay? We had to worry about an American provocation. So you had several American senators calling for the U.S. to recognize Taiwan as a non-NATO ally. This was Senator Menendez, a Democrat, and the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Lindsey Graham. So again, fortunately, the Biden folks are smarter than that and got the thing tamped down. But you could see an American provocation. So I think the answer is recognizing one's in a dangerous situation, caution, care, not to provoke something that could accidentally or unauthorized or in an unintended way. I don't worry about a war between China and the U.S. or a war between China and Taiwan happening intentionally. I think that's highly unlikely if we continue the policies we have. But I can easily imagine it happening unintended, where somehow a party takes an action not understanding its likely consequences. That triggers a reaction. That produces a spiral. And pretty soon you're with World War I, after the assassination of an Archduke, again, a war that nobody wanted.
Yeah, you mentioned the keyword. The small country should not provoke, but we are in a very thin line. It's very dangerous. I give you the example. Last year, Senator Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. China was extremely angry, and since then they have the war plan. Across the median line of Taiwan Strait. And then earlier this year, the Tsai Ing-wen, the visitor Senator McCarthy, again similar exercise. And lately, about 2 weeks ago, the presidential DPP candidate William Lai, the visit, only a stopover, but still China was angry, fiercely angry, and then they have a war plan, the military drill, all over Taiwan. So we just don't know, at which point they will say enough is enough, and then we will trigger a war. So as you say, there's not intended war, but unintentional war. So this is one of the potential situations. Are there any other situations you see that might trigger a war, between China and Taiwan, or China and the United States?
I think if you and I live to see a war between the U.S. and China in the next 4 or 5 years, I think it's a real possibility. But if it happens, I would put 80 of them, and I had 100 pennies to put against possible scenarios, the consultant's trick. I would put 80 of them on an unintended war. And unintended war, the way I explain this to American colleagues, I say this had happened the same way the last war between the U.S. and China occurred. People say, what? When was the last war between U.S. and China? In 1950. And how did that war occur? It occurred because, having come to the rescue of South Korea, MacArthur's troops were marching north towards the Chinese border, the Yalu, with believing it was impossible to provoke a war with China. The U.S. was Superman. It had just dropped atomic bombs next door in Japan to end the war. Mao had only the year before finally won the Civil War, still not fully consolidated. But unwittingly, MacArthur marched towards the border. China felt obliged to come into the war. We know how that ended. So that's, I think, if I would say, what should we worry about most, that's the case in which I could imagine Taiwanese being the provocation unwittingly, not because they wanted a war, or Chinese, or Americans, unfortunately, or maybe some of the other neighbors.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question. Should we Taiwanese be worried about the situation? Because I have many friends internationally. They are all very worried about the situation in Taiwan. The Henry Kissinger recently, visited China, met with Xi Jinping. He said one of his great concern is, as you said, something might happen if we are not cautious, between China and Taiwan. And then a lot of the U.S. company, multinational company recently being looking at the geopolitical situation in Taiwan, they stopped foreign direct investment. They slowed down. And then also there are many people, from Japan, from Hong Kong, from South Asia expressed concern. But Taiwan people, one of the issues is that we are not concerned at all. I mean, most of the Taiwanese people, so that's maybe a problematic, because of the two reasons. Number one, most Taiwanese believe that the U.S. will fight for Taiwan. So U.S. will protect Taiwan. Taiwan is too important for U.S. to lose or for Japan to lose. So something happened. U.S. will protect Taiwan no matter what. And number two, people say China will not attack Taiwan. China is economically recently, terrible chaos. Somebody predict the coming collapse of China, chapter 2, So people say, why should we be worried about? We are safe. We are safe. You should not see why. You should not talk down Taiwan. Taiwan will be safe. What's your view?
Good question. And you can expect my view is very much like yours. When people said to MacArthur, General MacArthur, he's marching his troops up the Korean Peninsula, being very successful. They said, China might come into this war. He said, forget about it. Forget about it. It's not possible. I mean, we actually are Superman. China they don't even have shoes, have a peasant army. They can't go and fight us. Never. Forget about it. And the answer is China entered the war, beat the Americans right back down to the 38th parallel. The war ended wherever it had started. So you look and think, okay, well, maybe. And again, if you go back to World War I, the case that I think everybody should study very carefully. How in the world did the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo, that you wouldn't have no one in Taiwan or China ever heard of it when it happened? It didn't even appear in the New York Times on the front page. So inconsequential. But 5 weeks later, all of the nations of Europe were at war. How can that happen? The answer is look at history. So history is replete with examples where quite intelligent people would say, forget about it. It's not possible. You don't even need to be concerned about it. What would turn out to be deadly wrong. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's also what happened in Ukraine. Before the war, I saw it on TV. A lot of people in Ukraine say, "Forget about it. Putin was just bluffing. He won't do anything." But then look at what's happening today. So I want to ask you a sensitive question. Say, will Taiwan be the next Ukraine? What can we be learned from Ukraine? And now one of the things we learned from Ukraine is that the U.S. will not send troops to fight for Ukraine. We'll supply them with a lot of military weapons, etc. And then this is what they call the agency war. So is that going to be the fate? Taiwan, is that a good analogy compared with Ukraine?
Well, there's several points there, but again, I agree with your instinct. The first is, even if the U.S. So let's imagine. Some provocation. In any case, China decides to declare war on Taiwan. And let's imagine the Americans come to Taiwan's support, even to the point of sending Americans to fight there. I think that's a big if. Still, at the end of that war, Taiwan is completely destroyed. So from Taiwan's perspective, any war between the U.S. and China is devastating for Taiwan. Doesn't matter who started it, how it started, who comes, how it comes, whatever. And then secondly, from Ukraine, I think they're very good lessons that the war in Ukraine is teaching people in Beijing, and they're studying it very carefully. As you know, Chinese study American wars even more carefully than we do. So they've been watching. And what have they discovered? First, they discovered combined operations, which is what's the challenge in Ukraine, in which you have army with armor, and air, and naval to some extent, and intelligence, all integrated, is very hard to do. If you haven't been doing this lately and haven't been practicing, extremely difficult. So look at the performance of the Russians, look at the performance of the Ukrainians, very hard. Right? Second thing, they've learned Russian equipment, which we were so impressed by before, we bought a lot of it, doesn't seem to be working very well. Right? Then they look and they say, American intelligence about what was going on in Ukraine is better, and what Russia was going to do is better than our intelligence. Well, we're supposed to know everything about Russia. All of our folks trained with them. We have an extent. So how do they know more about what's going on than we know? Well, we have to be. So, and then there's the integration of intelligence and prompt fires. So one of the most interesting things that happened in the changing character of war is that now precision targeting that's tightly linked to an immediate fire, so-called, or an attack on it, basically is decisive. So if I can find something down to a millimeter as a coordinate, and if I can strike that within 5 minutes or 10 minutes, wherever it is on the battlefield, 10 miles beyond, makes a big, big, big difference. So there's a lot of factors here changing that I think will lead China, PLA, to be thinking, we need to work harder on this. We need to prepare longer. And I think from the perspective of Taiwan, as long as every day when somebody says, well, you think today's a good day to go? Commander says, this is not such a good day. I need to practice more. I need to train. I need to prepare. I need whatever. That's the long-term game.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the readiness and the prepare for war. There are a lot of things saying that the best strategy to avoid war is get ready for the war. And the U.S. believe that Taiwan is not ready for the war, either physically or psychologically. Recently, Rand Corporation issued a report saying Taiwan is not prepared, very pessimistic about Taiwan's readiness for war. And then the U.S. is sending trainers, selling Taiwan weapons, and now recently had a military exercise, the recent military drill called Hanguang. Military drill is no longer fighting along the shore, but inside the city, prepare for that scenario. But then, but on the other hand, there are people saying the more you do that, the more sort of, you trigger, you make China angry. So, in order to avoid war, we should talk, we should communicate with China. On the one hand, U.S. say, we're ready, be prepared to combat. And on the other hand, people say, to avoid war, communicate more with China? What should we do?
I say both. So I don't think that many wars occurred because people were too prepared. So the American sort of slogan is the Roman slogan: if you want peace, prepare for war. So as long as when the PLA considers its options, they say, I'm not sure we can win this. I'm not sure that we can do it at a cost that's acceptable to us. So it would be better not to take military action. That's a better situation. And I think on the other hand, we don't want them to even be thinking about that question. So I would say finding ways to talk, to cooperate, to explain. And I say this to both Chinese and the Taiwanese. The past 50 years have been a miracle. Never in all of history of the people that lived in the cross straits have they seen such a big increase in their well-being, their health, their income, their education, their lives. So this is a success story. Don't screw it up.
Yeah.
And I would say that's a lesson for Americans first. I mean, I worry more about Americans. If I was Taiwanese, I would worry more about Taiwanese. If I was Chinese, I'd worry about Chinese. I worry about all of us, yeah.
Now, talking about American, what do you see the Biden's recent strategy? He seems to be doing a lot of things in Asia. Lately, Camp David, with Japan, Korea, form a trilateral agreement, and lately also going to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, so seem to be a corner, and also together with India, so he seems to be making some progress. But on the other hand, the U.S. politics, Trump might win the next election, and then that could be, it could be disastrous, for democracy, so a lot of uncertainty. But do you think that the U.S. now is getting an upper hand in its strategy against China? So you wouldn't say that?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that China has been surprised, and I've been surprised to some extent, by the extent to which the Biden team's commitment to alliances and to strengthening alliance relations has been successful. So one of the most damaging part of the Trump policies was undermining alliances. But if you look at this Camp David meeting this past weekend and the trilateral statement, but if you look at AUKUS with Australia and the UK, if you look at the U.S. South Korean Washington Declaration back in June, if you look at the Quad, that even includes India, the fact that you have in the geography of Asia a number of countries who believe that China should basically live within the framework that has been created over the past, almost 8 decades since World War II, and that if it's going to try to upset that balance of power, it's not only on a seesaw with the U.S., but there's some other folks sitting on our side of the seesaw. So that gives more weight to the situation. I think that's most likely to provide for more stability. So the Biden strategy is to try to build alliances in which the combined strength in different dimensions is sufficient to maintain an advantageous balance of power with China. And I think that's a good objective. And I think the U.S. would not be able to do this by itself, but with a group of allies in different issues. I think that's a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, and talking about the strategy, the alliance strategy seems to be working. But the strategy with Taiwan, again, still, the walking on the thin line. It used to be called strategic ambiguity, but seems to be we are gradually moving towards strategic clarity. There are even U.S. senators saying, recognizing Taiwan, be clear, Taiwan is different from China. So it is not what we do, but it's the U.S. is pushing toward that, and that may anger China. What's your view on that?
Well, I think President Biden himself and the Biden administration are very clear. They repeat over and over, we embrace the one China policy framework in which there is only one China its government rules from Beijing. We don't support a separate or independent Taiwan. And we strongly oppose any party's attempt to move unilaterally away from this framework. So basically, I think the framework has worked, even though it's got layers of ambiguity and even some almost inherent contradictions. It's working in practice. And as long as China doesn't seek by unilateral action to change that framework, or as Taiwan doesn't by unilateral, or the Americans by unilateral action, I think there's no reason to, in my view, to imagine that couldn't be successful for another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And then we let history decide. So it's quite possible that in 2049, when they get to the second centennial, maybe China has been so successful, its GDP is 3 times that of US, let's say. It could happen. And if that were the case, Taiwan's going to be dealing with a different China. And the US is going to be, it could also be the case that in 2049, the Chinese-American parity is roughly where it is now, or maybe even worse. Okay? If that were the case, that's a different situation. So I would say we should hold to the one China policy framework that's working, and we shouldn't have we should say to everybody, do not rock this boat. This is being successful, but then we should let history decide.
Yeah, one last question. What would be your advice to the Taiwanese people as well as to the Taiwan current leader or future leader? In the past, Taiwan policies, everybody want to maintain a status quo, but we know it's no longer possible. Xi Jinping, before 2027, he want to change. He want to have his legacy, and then there's also so many things happen internationally. So status quo may no longer be possible. But what would be your advice, to our people, to our leader under this great uncertainty?
Well, I always hesitate to be too prescriptive for other governments. My own government, I offer them my views regularly. But I would say if I were talking to the new president or Taiwanese people, I would say first realize Taiwan is a miracle. Is one of the great success stories of the last 50 years. So for folks like yourself and the other leaders of Taiwan, you all have created something amazing. One of the most successful stories in the past 50 years. You have a vibrant democracy, a vibrant free market economy. You're a tech leader. So this is fantastic. And this has happened mainly because of hard work by Taiwanese, but also within the framework of a one China policy framework that was created 50 years ago that has not given everybody everything that they wanted, but has provided enough of what each required to let this happen. So we should focus on that and we should sustain it. And in particular, we should notice, of course, conditions change. So Taiwan is not the Taiwan of 50 years ago. My God, China is not the China of 50 years ago.
Exactly.
America. So there's no, quote, status quo. The world changes all the time. But the one China policy framework has been flexible enough to evolve successfully. So I don't see any reason that we shouldn't try to find ways to sustain that. And I think that's plausible to do. And so that's my hope. And my belief is that's what President Biden and his team are trying to achieve. Now, what will happen with the Taiwanese politics and the next government, and what could happen if we ended up with a Trump government? And there are many, many things that could happen in the U.S. or Taiwan or China that we don't know about. But we know we've got a pretty good framework that's produced about 50 years of something amazing. And I would say that's something to be thankful for, but also to be careful not to, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Yes.
Thank you. Exactly. thank you very much once again, Professor, for your excellent advice, and it is very enlightening. And I think we all learned a great deal about, not only the Taiwanese people, but also the Taiwan current and the future leaders. We hope that sometime later this year, we'll be able to invite you to Taiwan. I trust you've been visited Taiwan before, so we look forward to staying in touch.
I've visited a number of times. Always I've enjoyed it. So I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Have a good evening.